The road to confrontation. The early afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty highway as 90-year-old Henry Grayson guided his old pickup truck through the winding roads of the countryside. The truck sputtered and coughed, its age a testament to decades of loyal service. Henry didn't mind. It matched him in spirit, weathered but unyielding. His destination was a small town just 20 miles away, where he planned to pick up supplies for his modest farmhouse. Henry wasn't just any old man, a retired colonel who had served with distinction. He carried the weight of his experiences quietly. He lived alone now, his beloved wife, Margaret, having passed away years ago. Though their children visited occasionally, Henry spent most days tending to his garden, feeding the chickens, and reading under the shade of an ancient oak tree. Life was simple, and he liked it that way. As he drove, his thoughts drifted to the past. He recalled moments of camaraderie with his fellow soldiers, the missions that tested his limits, and the sacrifices that had been made. Those memories had forged him into a man of discipline, resilience, and unshakable resolve. Yet, even in the face of war, Henry had never been as alone as he sometimes felt now. The peace of the drive was interrupted by the roar of motorcycle engines. Henry glanced in his rearview mirror to see a line of bikers approaching fast. Their aggressive weaving and loud engines broke the stillness of the countryside. At first, Henry thought they would pass him by, but as they drew closer, something about their formation made him uneasy. He pulled his truck to the side of the road to let them pass, but instead of continuing on their way, the bikers slowed and surrounded him. There were 7 of them, all clad in black leather adorned with patches and skulls. Their leader, a burly man with a shaved head and a jagged scar down his cheek, dismounted and approached Henry's truck. "Afternoon, Grandpa," the man sneered, leaning on the truck's hood. "What brings you out here? This is our turf." Henry remained calm, his sharp blue eyes studying the man. "I'm just passing through," he said evenly. "Don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" The man laughed, motioning for his crew to join him. "What kind of trouble could an old-timer like you cause?" The bikers jeered, their voices echoing across the empty road. One of them kicked the truck's fender, leaving a dent. Henry's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had faced far worse than a group of overconfident bullies. "Enough," Henry said, his voice low but firm. "You've had your fun. Now move along." The leader chuckled and stepped closer. "Or what? What's an old man like you gonna do about it?" Henry didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old flip phone. The sight of the outdated device drew another round of laughter from the bikers. "What are you gonna do, Grandpa? Call bingo night?" one of them mocked. Henry pressed a few buttons and held the phone to his ear. His voice was steady as he said, "It's me. I need you here. Now." The bikers exchanged confused glances, their bravado faltering. "Who'd you call?" the leader demanded, his tone losing its edge. Henry snapped the phone shut and slipped it back into his pocket. A faint smile played on his lips. "You'll find out." Moments later, the distant hum of approaching vehicles broke the uneasy silence. The sound grew louder, distinct from the rumble of motorcycles. The bikers turned their heads, their smirks vanishing as a convoy of black SUVs and trucks crested the hill, kicking up a cloud of dust. The vehicles came to a stop just yards away from Henry's truck, and their doors opened in unison. Men and women in plain black tactical gear stepped out, their movements precise and deliberate. The tension was palpable as they formed a protective line around Henry. One of them, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, walked up to him and saluted. "Colonel Henry," he said, his voice filled with respect. "Apologies for the delay, sir." Henry returned the salute with a nod. "You're right on time, Corporal." The bikers were frozen, their earlier confidence replaced by visible unease. "Who are these people?" the leader stammered. Henry's smile widened. "Friends." The tactical team moved swiftly. 2 members approached the bikers, their calm but imposing presence leaving no room for argument. "Leave," one of them said, his tone icy. "And don't come back." The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled to their motorcycles and sped away, their engines fading into the distance. As the dust settled, the corporal turned to Henry. "Anything else, sir?" Henry shook his head. "That'll be all. Thank you." The team dispersed, leaving Henry alone by his truck. He leaned on his cane, his weathered face calm but his mind racing. He had sent a message, but he knew the bikers wouldn't let this humiliation go unanswered. Later that evening, as Henry sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, a sense of unease crept over him. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: this was far from over. Shadows of the past. The following morning, Henry awoke early to the sound of birdsong drifting through the open window. The tranquility of his small farmhouse seemed at odds with the tension lingering in his chest. Though the bikers had fled the previous day, Henry knew the confrontation was only the beginning. Trouble had a way of finding him, even in his twilight years. He moved through his morning routine with practiced ease, brewing coffee and tending to his garden. The tomatoes and squash had grown well this season, their vibrant colors a testament to his careful nurturing. As he worked, his mind drifted back to his days in the military. The camaraderie of his unit, the intensity of battle, and the sacrifices they'd made together. Those memories were etched into his very being, a constant reminder of who he was and what he had overcome. Yet, as much as Henry tried to focus on the present, the events of the previous day refused to leave him in peace. The sight of those bikers surrounding his truck, their sneering faces and mocking laughter, played over and over in his mind. He had dealt with bullies before, on the battlefield, in the barracks, and even in civilian life. But something about this group unsettled him. They weren't just a gang looking for trouble. There was a darker purpose behind their actions. By mid-morning, Henry decided he couldn't sit idle any longer. He retrieved an old wooden chest from the attic, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Inside were relics of his past, medals, photographs, and a small collection of tools that had once been the lifeline of his unit. Among them was an envelope filled with letters from his late wife, Margaret. Her words were a source of comfort and strength, even years after her passing. Henry ran his fingers over the faded ink, her familiar handwriting bringing a bittersweet smile to his face. Margaret had always been his anchor, the one who kept him grounded through the chaos of war and the trials of life. He missed her more than words could express, but he knew she would expect him to face this new challenge with the same resolve he had shown in their years together. The sound of gravel crunching under tires pulled Henry from his thoughts. He stood and peered out the window to see a truck approaching. The vehicle came to a stop in his driveway, and a man stepped out. It was Frank, an old war buddy who had served alongside Henry in some of the most harrowing battles of their youth. Frank was a bear of a man, his broad shoulders and rugged demeanor giving him an air of unshakable confidence. "Morning, Colonel," Frank called out with a grin, using the nickname he had always insisted on. "Thought I'd check in on you." Henry met him on the porch, his expression softening at the sight of his old friend. "Frank, what brings you out here?" Frank shrugged, leaning against the railing. "Heard about some trouble on the highway. Figured it might involve you." Henry chuckled dryly. "Word travels fast. You know how it is. People talk, especially when you call in reinforcements like that." Henry gestured for Frank to sit, and the two men settled into the rocking chairs on the porch. As the conversation turned to old memories, Henry found himself recounting the encounter with the bikers. Frank listened intently, his brow furrowing as the story unfolded. "Doesn't sound like your average gang," Frank said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "These guys seem organized. Dangerous." Henry nodded. "That's what I'm worried about. They didn't just happen upon me by chance. They were looking for trouble." Frank leaned forward, his voice low. "You think they'll come back?" "I'd bet on it," Henry replied. And next time, they'll be better prepared. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Frank stood and clapped a hand on Henry's shoulder. "Well, if they're coming, they'll find more than they bargained for," Frank said. "You're not facing this alone, Colonel. Not this time." Henry felt a surge of gratitude for his friend's unwavering loyalty. "Thanks, Frank. I appreciate it." The rest of the day was spent preparing for what Henry suspected was inevitable. Together, he and Frank reinforced the farmhouse's defenses, setting up simple yet effective traps around the property. They worked in companionable silence, their movements efficient and purposeful. For Henry, it was a reminder of the days when they had relied on each other to survive in hostile territory. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Henry and Frank sat on the porch once more. They shared a quiet meal, the tension between them unspoken but understood. Henry glanced at the old flip phone sitting on the table, its presence a silent acknowledgement of the allies he had called upon. "You think they'll show up tonight?" Frank asked, breaking the silence. Henry took a sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "If they're smart, they'll wait, but I wouldn't count on it." Frank nodded, his expression grim. "Then we'd better be ready." As night fell, the quiet of the countryside seemed almost too perfect, like the calm before a storm. Henry stood by the window, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Frank had taken up position near the barn, his silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. The tension was palpable, each man keenly aware of the stakes. Hours passed, the stillness of the night broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. Henry's mind raced, running through countless scenarios and strategies. He knew he couldn't predict every move the bikers would make, but he was determined to be ready for anything. As the clock struck midnight, the faint hum of motorcycle engines reached Henry's ears. He straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle resting against the wall. The sound grew louder, the unmistakable roar of multiple bikes piercing the silence. Henry exchanged a glance with Frank, who nodded in acknowledgement. The bikers were coming, just as Henry had expected. But this time, they would find a man who had spent his entire life preparing for battles like this, and he wasn't about to back down. The call for reinforcements, the low rumble of engines grew louder, echoing ominously through the quiet countryside. From the porch of his farmhouse, Henry stood like a sentinel, his sharp blue eyes fixed on the dirt road stretching out into the darkness. His grip tightened on the rifle cradled in his arms, the weight of it familiar and reassuring. Frank emerged from the barn, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow in the moonlight. "Sounds like they brought the cavalry," he muttered, glancing toward the horizon, where faint headlights began to appear. Henry gave a grim nod. "I counted at least 7 bikes last time. This sounds like more." Frank shifted his weight, his hand resting on the sidearm holstered at his hip. "You sure we got enough here to hold them off?" "No," Henry replied honestly, his voice steady. "But we don't need to fight them head-on. We just need to send a message." The headlights drew closer, illuminating a trail of dust that hung in the air like a ghostly veil. Henry's thoughts turned to the tactical team he had called the previous day. They had made short work of the bikers, but Henry hadn't summoned them tonight. This was personal. He wasn't going to rely on others unless absolutely necessary. "Let's get into position," Henry said, his tone decisive. Frank nodded and moved toward the barn, where they had prepared a series of fallback points and makeshift defenses. Henry, meanwhile, headed toward the house, his movements deliberate and silent. Inside, he retrieved an old field radio from the chest in the living room. It was battered but functional, a relic from his days in the military. With practiced hands, Henry tuned the radio to a private frequency he hadn't used in years. Static crackled in his ear as he adjusted the dials, his heart steady but his mind racing. Finally, a voice broke through the noise. "This is Sentinel. Who's calling?" Henry hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "It's Colonel Henry Grayson. I need support." The line went quiet for a beat before the voice returned, more focused now. "Colonel, it's been a long time. What's the situation?" Henry gave a concise summary, his tone clipped and professional. The voice on the other end listened without interruption, then replied, "Understood, Colonel. We'll mobilize and be en route within the hour. Hang tight." Henry set the receiver down and exhaled slowly. Reinforcements were coming, but he knew they wouldn't arrive in time for the initial wave. For now, it was just him, Frank, and the tools of their trade. He moved to the front of the house, positioning himself near a reinforced window with a clear view of the driveway. The bikers arrived moments later, their engines cutting off one by one as they parked in a semicircle at the edge of the property. There were at least a dozen of them this time, and they didn't come alone. 2 trucks rumbled to a stop behind the bikes, their doors swinging open to reveal men armed with bats, crowbars, and pistols. The leader, the same burly man with a scared cheek from before, stepped forward. He carried himself with a swagger, but Henry could see the anger in his eyes. The humiliation of their previous encounter still burned, and he had come looking for payback. "Henry Grayson," the leader shouted, his voice cutting through the night. "You made a fool out of us. Nobody does that and walks away. Come out, and maybe we'll make this quick." From his position, Henry watched the group closely, noting their movements and formations. They were spread out, too confident in their numbers to anticipate resistance. That was their first mistake. Henry stepped out onto the porch, his rifle slung across his shoulder. The dogs that had taken up residence on his property growled low, their hackles raised. They flanked Henry like loyal soldiers, their presence unnerving the bikers. "You should have stayed away," Henry called back, his voice carrying an edge that silenced the murmurs among the group. "But since you're here, let me make something clear. You don't scare me. Not yesterday, not today, and not ever." The leader's sneer widened into a grin. Brave words for an old man. Let's see how long that lasts. He raised his hand, signaling his men to advance. The bikers moved toward the house, their steps heavy with overconfidence. Henry waited, his posture calm but alert. As the first attacker reached the edge of the porch, a sharp snap echoed through the air. A tripwire hidden in the grass triggered, releasing a log that swung down and slammed into the man's chest, sending him sprawling. The sudden commotion startled the group, their heads snapping toward the noise. Before they could react, Frank opened fire from the barn, his shots precise and deliberate. 2 men dropped to the ground, clutching their legs in pain. The remaining bikers scrambled for cover, their bravado replaced by panic. Henry didn't waste the opportunity. He raised his rifle and fired, the sharp crack of the shot cutting through the chaos. One of the truck's tires exploded, its hiss of air sending the driver scrambling for safety. The dogs sprang into action, darting between the shadows and snapping at the heels of the attackers. "Fall back," the leader shouted, his confidence visibly shaken. "Regroup by the trucks." The bikers retreated, their movements frantic. Henry and Frank used the lull to reposition, moving to pre-planned defensive points around the property. Henry's mind raced as he assessed the situation. They had bought themselves time, but the bikers wouldn't give up so easily. As the attackers regrouped near the trucks, the sound of distant engines reached their ears. The leader's head snapped up, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. The reinforcements Henry had called were arriving, their convoy of black SUVs cutting through the darkness like a hammer poised to strike. The tactical team didn't waste a second. They dismounted and moved with practiced precision, their weapons trained on the bikers. The leader's face twisted in rage as he realized he had been outmaneuvered. "This isn't over, old man," he shouted, retreating to his bike. Henry stepped forward, his rifle steady in his hands. "You're right. It's not over. But next time, you won't walk away." The bikers scrambled to their vehicles and sped off, their engines roaring as they disappeared into the night. Henry lowered his rifle, his sharp eyes watching until the dust settled. The leader of the tactical team approached, his expression calm but respectful. "Colonel, are you all right?" Henry nodded, his voice steady. "We're fine. Thanks for getting here when you did." The man nodded. "We'll sweep the area, make sure they didn't leave any surprises." Henry turned to Frank, who was leaning against the barn with a satisfied grin. "Good work," Henry said simply. Frank chuckled. "Not bad for a couple of old-timers, huh?" As the tactical team secured the area, Henry allowed himself a moment of respite. The battle was won, but he knew the war was far from over. The bikers wouldn't take this defeat lightly, and their retaliation would be swift and brutal. Henry glanced at the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear. The fight ahead would test him in ways he hadn't faced in decades, but he was ready. This was his home, and he would defend it with everything he had. A storm brews. The quiet of dawn settled over Henry's farmhouse, the golden light casting long shadows across the fields. The tactical team had left after sweeping the property, leaving Henry and Frank alone once more. Though the immediate danger had passed, Henry knew this wasn't the end. The bikers had retreated, but their anger would fester, and they would return, stronger, smarter, and more determined. Henry sat on the porch, his rifle resting across his knees, as Frank brought 2 steaming mugs of coffee from inside. They sat in silence for a while, the unspoken tension between them thick. It was Frank who finally broke the quiet. "They're not gonna forget this, Henry," he said, his voice low. "We humiliated them twice now. That kind of blow to their pride doesn't go unanswered." Henry took a sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable. "I'm counting on it." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You want them to come back?" Henry leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "If they come here, I control the battlefield. Out there, I don't. They'll come back, Frank. And when they do, I'll be ready." Frank let out a low whistle. "You've got guts, Colonel. I'll give you that." Henry didn't reply. Instead, he stood and walked toward the barn, his steps slow but deliberate. Frank followed, his curiosity piqued. Inside, Henry opened a small trapdoor hidden beneath an old workbench. From the concealed compartment, he pulled out a metal case, its surface scarred and battered. He placed it on the workbench and opened it, revealing an array of gear that gleamed faintly in the dim light. "Where'd you get all this?" Frank asked, his tone a mix of surprise and admiration. "Collected it over the years," Henry replied, inspecting a set of tripwires. "Never thought I'd need it again, but here we are." Frank picked up a small cylindrical device and turned it over in his hands. "Flashbangs." Henry nodded, figured they might come in handy. As the 2 men worked to prepare the property for the next attack, Henry's thoughts turned to the bikers. Their leader, with his scared face and cruel smile, was clearly more than just a thug. He had a plan, and he wouldn't stop until Henry was either broken or gone. But Henry had faced men like him before, men who underestimated the strength of those they thought were weak. By midday, the farmhouse had been transformed into a fortress. Hidden traps lined the driveway, motion sensors were placed strategically around the property, and defensive positions were reinforced. Henry and Frank worked tirelessly, their years of training and experience making the preparations efficient and precise. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Henry called for a break. They sat on the porch again, the dogs lounging nearby. Henry handed Frank a cold beer, and they clinked bottles in silent acknowledgement of the day's work. "You ever think about walking away?" Frank asked suddenly. Henry glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "I have. But this is my home, Frank. It's where Margaret and I built our life. I'm not leaving it behind. Not for anyone." Frank nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Well, I hope she's watching, wherever she is. She'd be proud." Henry smiled faintly, the mention of Margaret bringing a bittersweet warmth to his chest. "She always said I was too stubborn for my own good. Guess she was right." The moment of levity was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. Both men tensed, their hands instinctively moving to their weapons. Henry stood, his eyes narrowing as he watched the car pull into the driveway. It was a black sedan, sleek and unmarked, its windows tinted. The car came to a stop, and the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, his movements calm and deliberate. He was tall and lean, with sharp features and a coiled snake tattoo that peeked out from the collar of his jacket. His presence radiated danger, and Henry's instincts immediately went on high alert. "Viper," Frank muttered under his breath. Henry's grip tightened on his rifle. He had heard of men like Viper during his time in the military, calculating, ruthless, and utterly without mercy. This wasn't just a gang leader. This was a strategist, someone who thought 3 steps ahead of his enemies. Viper raised his hands, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Colonel Henry Grayson," he said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "I've heard a lot about you." Henry stepped forward, his posture stiff but controlled. "You've got 1 minute to explain why you're here before I send you back the way you came." Viper's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "I'm here to talk, Colonel. That's all. No weapons, no tricks. Just a conversation." Henry didn't lower his rifle. "You think I'm stupid enough to believe that?" Viper spread his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Believe what you want, but if I wanted you dead, you'd already be 6 feet under." Frank scoffed. Bold words for a man standing in the middle of enemy territory. Viper's gaze flicked to Frank, his expression unreadable. "I'm not your enemy. Not yet." Henry took a step closer, his tone sharp. "Then what are you?" Viper's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. "I'm a problem solver. Your little stunts have caused quite a stir in my organization, and I've been sent to clean it up. But I'm not unreasonable, Colonel. I respect a man who fights for what's his." Henry's eyes narrowed. "If you respect me, you'll leave. Now." Viper shook his head slowly. "I can't do that. Not without an agreement. You stand down, leave the area, and I'll make sure my people don't bother you again." Frank let out a bark of laughter. "You really think we're gonna buy that?" Viper ignored him, his focus solely on Henry. "You've proven your point, Colonel. You're a tough man, but this isn't a fight you can win. Not forever." Henry didn't blink. "If you think I'm going to abandon my home, you don't know me at all." Viper studied him for a moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "Very well. Have it your way." Without another word, Viper turned and walked back to his car. He got in, started the engine, and drove away, the taillights fading into the distance. Henry and Frank stood in silence, the weight of the encounter settling over them like a heavy fog. "You think he's coming back?" Frank asked finally. Henry's jaw tightened. "I know he is. And next time, he won't come alone." Henry knew Viper's visit was just the beginning. The storm was brewing, and the fight ahead would test him in ways he hadn't been tested in decades. But if Viper thought he could break him, he was about to learn the hard way that Henry Grayson wasn't a man who backed down. The battle lines are drawn. The house was quiet that night, but the silence felt uneasy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Henry sat at his kitchen table, staring at a map of his property spread out before him. Every tree line, every fence post, and every blind spot had been meticulously marked. Frank sat across from him, polishing a pistol with a calmness that belied the tension in the air. "You know they'll come in force this time," Frank said, breaking the silence. "Viper isn't the kind of man to let a conversation be the end of it." Henry nodded, his jaw tight. "That wasn't a visit. It was a warning. He wanted us to know he's not done." Frank leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the map. "So, what's the plan, Colonel?" Henry looked up, his expression resolute. "We use their arrogance against them. They'll expect us to stand our ground, defend the house. But we're not going to fight on their terms." Frank raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" Henry's lips curled into a faint smile. "We draw them in, isolate them, and take them down one by one. Frank chuckled, a low, approving sound. Old school tactics. I like it. The two men worked late into the night, refining their strategy. They set up additional traps around the property, reinforcing choke points and creating escape routes. Henry's years of military experience guided every decision, each move designed to exploit the bikers' overconfidence. As dawn broke, Henry stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and wildflowers. It was hard to believe that soon, this peaceful land would become a battlefield. Frank joined him, a cup of coffee in hand. You think we'll have enough time to finish preparing? Henry sipped his own coffee, his gaze steady. We'll make time. We don't have a choice. The day was spent in rigorous preparation. Henry and Frank moved through the property with purpose, setting up decoys and hidden cameras to monitor the bikers' movements. They dug shallow trenches near the tree line, creating hidden positions that offered both cover and concealment. Every detail was accounted for, every contingency planned. By mid-afternoon, Henry paused to take stock of their work. The property was as fortified as it could be. He felt a surge of pride, not just in the defenses they had built, but in the resilience that had carried him through a lifetime of challenges. Frank approached, his face lined with exhaustion, but his spirit unbroken. It's coming together, Colonel, but I can't shake the feeling that we're still outnumbered. Henry placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. We've been outnumbered before. It didn't stop us then, and it won't stop us now. Frank nodded, his resolve hardening. Let's finish this. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in hues of orange and gold, Henry and Frank shared a quiet meal on the porch. The dogs sat at their feet, their ears twitching at every distant sound. The stillness of the evening was deceptive, a fragile calm before the inevitable storm. Henry's old flip phone buzzed on the table, breaking the quiet. He picked it up and saw a familiar name on the screen. Jack. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Henry. Jack's voice crackled through the line, urgent and tense. They're mobilizing. Viper's bringing a full crew, 20, maybe 30 men, and they're armed to the teeth. Henry's grip on the phone tightened. When? Tonight, Jack replied. They're leaving their base now. You've got a few hours at most. Henry's voice was calm, but his heart pounded. Thanks, Jack. Be careful, Henry, Jack said. These aren't just bikers. They're professionals. Henry hung up and turned to Frank. It's time. Frank stood, his expression grim. Let's give them a welcome they'll never forget. The arrival. Night fell swiftly, the darkness cloaking the farmhouse in shadows. Henry and Frank moved silently through the property, each man taking up his designated position. The dogs, sensing the tension, remained alert and ready. The first sound of approaching engines reached them just after midnight. The deep rumble grew louder, accompanied by the faint glow of headlights cutting through the darkness. Henry watched from a concealed position near the barn, his rifle steady in his hands. The convoy came into view, a dozen motorcycles flanked by 3 trucks. They moved with precision, their formation tight and disciplined. This wasn't a disorganized gang looking for trouble. This was an assault team, and they had come prepared. The vehicles stopped just beyond the fence line, their occupants dismounting with practiced efficiency. Viper emerged from one of the trucks, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of a flashlight. He barked orders, his voice carrying through the night. Spread out. I want this place locked down. The men fanned out, their movements deliberate and coordinated. They carried rifles and shotguns, their presence a stark contrast to the rowdy bikers Henry had faced before. These were professionals, just as Jack had warned. Henry waited, his breathing steady, as the first group moved toward the driveway. They triggered a tripwire hidden beneath the gravel, setting off a small explosion that sent dirt and debris flying. The men scattered, shouting in confusion. Frank opened fire from his position near the tree line, his shots precise and devastating. 2 men went down, their weapons clattering to the ground. The rest scrambled for cover, returning fire blindly into the darkness. Henry used the chaos to his advantage. He shifted to a new position, his movements silent and deliberate. From his vantage point, he spotted Viper directing his men with cold precision. Henry raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger, but he held his fire. He needed to wait for the right moment. As the attackers regrouped, Henry activated a hidden noisemaker near the barn. The sudden screeching sound drew their attention, pulling them toward another trap. A second explosion rocked the night, sending more men sprawling. "Fall back!" Viper shouted, his composure beginning to crack. "Regroup by the trucks." Henry smiled grimly. He had them exactly where he wanted them. The turning point. The tide of the battle shifted as Henry and Frank systematically dismantled the attackers' formation. Each trap, each shot, was a calculated move in a larger strategy. The bikers' confidence eroded with every step, their numbers dwindling under the relentless assault. Viper, however, remained a formidable adversary. He moved through the chaos with purpose, rallying his men and directing their efforts. It was clear he was more than a leader. He was a predator, and Henry was his target. As the firefight raged on, Henry found himself face to face with Viper near the barn. The 2 men locked eyes, their weapons raised, but momentarily still. "You're a stubborn old man," Viper said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you're a fool," Henry replied. "You should have stayed away." Viper smirked, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Let's finish this." The night erupted into chaos once more as the battle reached its climax. The final stand. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder as the firefight intensified. The once quiet countryside was now a war zone, with flashes of gunfire lighting up the night. Henry crouched behind the barn's corner, his rifle steady in his hands, his breath controlled. Across the property, Frank held his position near the tree line, his figure barely visible in the shadows. The bikers had regrouped near the trucks, their movements frantic but coordinated under Viper's barked orders. Though they had come in overwhelming numbers, the traps, the terrain, and the sheer determination of their opponents had begun to wear them down. But Henry knew they weren't finished. Viper wasn't a man to retreat without delivering his message. From his position, Henry could see Viper rallying his men, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Push forward. Don't let them pin us down. The old man's out of tricks." Henry smirked at the irony. The traps and defenses they had seen so far were only the beginning. A tactical retreat. Henry pressed the transmitter of the radio clipped to his jacket. "Frank, fall back to the house. Time to lure them in." Frank's response crackled through the earpiece. "Copy that. On my way." Henry moved quickly and silently, retreating from the barn to the main house. He slipped inside, locking the door behind him. The house was dark, its interior a maze of reinforced furniture and pre-prepared choke points. Frank joined him moments later, his breathing heavy but steady. "They're pushing hard," Frank said, his voice low. "But they're breaking formation. That Viper guy is losing control." "That's what we want," Henry replied. "The more desperate they get, the sloppier they'll become." Frank nodded, reloading his pistol. "What's next?" Henry glanced toward the boarded-up windows. "They'll breach the house. When they do, we funnel them into the traps inside. Close quarters favors us. They won't expect us to fight them hand to hand." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You sure your body's up for that, Colonel?" Henry allowed himself a faint grin. "I might be old, but I'm not done yet." Breach and counterattack. The sound of boots crunching on gravel grew louder as the bikers advanced toward the house. Henry and Frank stayed low, their weapons ready. The dogs growled softly from their positions near the back door, their instincts honed by years of survival in wild. The first loud bang shattered the night as the front door was kicked open. The bikers stormed in, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Henry and Frank waited in silence, their bodies tense as they prepared to spring the next phase of their plan. As the attackers moved deeper into the house, one of them triggered a pressure plate hidden beneath the rug. The resulting explosion of a flashbang grenade disoriented the group, their shouts of confusion echoing through the narrow halls. Henry and Frank moved quickly, taking advantage of the chaos. Frank fired 2 shots, taking down the men closest to him. Henry used the butt of his rifle to incapacitate another attacker, his movements precise and deliberate. The bikers, now realizing they had walked into a trap, began to retreat toward the door. But Henry wasn't about to let them go. He activated a hidden tripwire, triggering a series of heavy beams to swing down from the ceiling. The attackers were knocked off their feet, their weapons clattering to the ground. Viper's voice rang out from outside. "Regroup. Regroup. Don't let them split us up." Henry exchanged a glance with Frank. "He's coming in next." A battle of wits. The house fell silent for a moment, the bikers regrouping just outside the door. Henry and Frank took the opportunity to reload and reposition. The traps had thinned the attackers' numbers, but Viper was still out there, and Henry knew the real fight was just beginning. When the next wave came, it was more calculated. Viper led the charge himself, his movements deliberate and controlled. He moved through the house with an almost predatory grace, his men fanning out behind him. Henry and Frank held their ground, forcing the attackers into narrow hallways where their numbers counted for less. The 2 sides clashed in a brutal close-quarters battle. Henry's rifle cracked as he fired at an attacker, while Frank fought off 2 men with a crowbar. The bikers were relentless, but Henry and Frank were fighting for more than just survival. They were defending the place Henry had built, the memories that lived within its walls. Viper finally came face to face with Henry in the living room. The 2 men locked eyes, their weapons trained on each other. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. "You've put up quite a fight," Viper said, his tone almost admiring. "But this ends now." Henry's gaze didn't waver. "You don't belong here." Viper smirked. "And you don't belong in my way." The room erupted into chaos as the 2 men fired simultaneously. Henry dove for cover behind an overturned couch, the bullet whizzing past his ear. Viper moved with practiced ease, using the furniture as a shield as he advanced. Henry's mind raced as he calculated his next move. He knew Viper was dangerous, but he also knew the house better than anyone. He activated a hidden mechanism beneath the floorboards, releasing a trapdoor that sent Viper tumbling into the basement. The showdown. Henry descended into the basement cautiously, his rifle trained on the figure below. Viper was on his feet, his weapon gone but his knife gleaming in the dim light. The 2 men faced off, the tension between them palpable. "You're a stubborn old man," Viper said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you're just another bully who thought I'd roll over," Henry replied. Viper lunged, his knife slicing through the air. Henry sidestepped, using his rifle to block the attack. The 2 men grappled, their movements brutal and unrelenting. Though Viper was younger and faster, Henry's experience and sheer determination gave him the edge. Finally, with a swift maneuver, Henry disarmed Viper and pinned him to the ground. He pressed the barrel of his rifle against Viper's chest, his breath coming in short bursts. "It's over," Henry said, his voice cold. Viper glared up at him, his eyes filled with rage. "You think this changes anything? There will always be more like me." Henry didn't flinch. "Maybe, but not here." Aftermath. By the time the sun rose, the bikers were gone, their forces broken and scattered. Frank stood on the porch, surveying the damage. The house bore the scars of the battle, but it still stood, a testament to the resilience of the man who called it home. Henry joined him, his body aching but his spirit unbroken. The dogs lounged nearby, their loyalty evident in the way they watched him. "You think they'll come back?" Frank asked. Henry shook his head. "Not for a long time. And if they do, we'll be ready." Frank chuckled. "You're one tough son of a gun, Colonel." Henry allowed himself a faint smile. "I'd had a lot of practice." As the two men sat on the porch, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, casting the land in a warm golden glow. For now, the battle was over, and peace had returned to Henry's farmhouse. But he knew that peace was something you had to fight for, and he was more than willing to fight again.